Today, we're exploring interest rate risk, how it affects ordinary people, corporate decision makers, banks, and other financial intermediaries. We'll talk about how interest rate risk arises naturally from the business of financial intermediation, which we will explain in simple terms, and how a catastrophic turn of events brought about a supposedly simple case of interest rate risk management into a nightmare situation that brought down a US bank as recently as 2023. So let's start with the definition of interest rate risk, or IRR, from a regulator's point of view. It's the risk that changes in interest rates will reduce the value of financial assets, increase liabilities, or destabilize cash flows. Here's a formal definition from the FDIC. Interest rate risk is the exposure of a bank's current or future earnings and capital to adverse changes in market rates. This risk is a normal part of banking and can be an important source of profitability and shareholder value. However, excessive interest rate risk can threaten banks' earnings, capital, liquidity, and solvency. Therefore, it's important to effectively identify, measure, monitor, and control interest rate risk exposure through effective policies and risk management processes. So pay attention to what the regulators look at. The impact to current and future earnings, income or profit and loss, the impact to capital, assets minus liability or net equity, liquidity issues, here meaning the need to have a large amount of cash to service cash needs, and solvency issues, meaning the ability to pay the debts that fall due aside from just liabilities being more than assets. And how do these things happen? Well, it goes something like this. Remember the chart of bonds versus interest rate risk that we had before? When interest rates rise, assets lose market value as higher interest rates create steeper discounts, bringing the present value of all future cash flows lower and causing asset valuations to fall. So kindly review our video on bonds and math for finance, where we talk about duration as the sensitivity of a bond to interest rate movements. As interest rates go up, bond prices come down and vice versa. Now, although this is a valuation loss, it can easily become a cash loss if, because of a need for cash, the assets need to be sold, thus realizing the market valuation loss. We shall get back to this later. Of course, higher interest rates also mean that current yields will also go up, and which should reflect improved profit and loss statements or P&Ls compared to the previous interest rate regime. So it's a mixed bag, and it very much depends on the mix of assets and liabilities of a bank or financial institution and their sensitivity to interest rates. Of course, when interest rates fall, the opposite happens. While asset value should go up because of repricing, reinvestment income declines, so there might be earning dips even when asset values go up. The point is that because interest rates are the prices of money over time, changing them changes the value of everything built on money. Therefore, this can either improve or mess up the business of financial intermediation since prices can become volatile. Thus, we need to talk about the concept of financial intermediation, where people, companies, and banks and financial intermediaries interact, and why these interest rate risks arise in the first place. Financial intermediation. Conceptually, the financial intermediary is the middleman that aggregates all the supplier of funds, pools money together, and provides this fund to the user of funds. For simplicity, let's consider only a bank. The bank provides a service to the supplier of funds, borrowing money, which is a bank liability, from a huge pool of savers, providing them with an interest rate so that they rather hand their money over to the bank and earn something rather than holding on to their money but earning nothing. The bank, on the other hand, will lend this money to a borrower, normally in the form of a longer-term contract, let's say like a mortgage loan, which is a bank asset. Because of the inherent risk in the mismatch of the timing of the cash flows, short-term liabilities versus long-term assets, there is what's called a gap. Nevertheless, the bank charges a higher interest rate on the borrower of the fund versus what the bank borrows at from the suppliers of the fund. So the bank can make money and remain as a going concern, providing this service of intermediation. Otherwise, if it won't make money from intermediating, then it will quit the service and force savers to look for borrowers themselves, which will likely be more expensive and time-consuming for all concerned. This process is called disintermediation, the opposite of intermediation. From this simple explanation, we evoke a situation where the bank borrows short-term funds from the supplier of funds and lends them out long-term to the user of funds. Viewed from this perspective, the intermediary is not only performing intermediation per se, but also doing maturity transformation, converting short-term deposits into long-term loans. However, they can also do the reverse, borrowing long-term via issuing bonds to fund short-term deposits when needed when circumstances warrant it. It's like chunks of short-term contracts being aggregated into long-term contracts for use by long-term users, like chunks and pieces of meat being transformed into long sausages. Hope that helps visualize maturity transformation, although the reverse can also be done surprisingly. Now let's summarize the situation of our simplistic bank. He has assets, which are long-term mortgages, liabilities, which are short-term deposits, and there's some P&L or their income statement, and then you got capital. For example, the assets could be a long-term loan at 5% for 10 years, and the liabilities might be borrowing at 1% for at most 1 year. So what's going to flow through the P&L or the income statement would be a margin of 5% minus 1%, assuming no reserves and no other costs. Now imagine that interest rates move up by 1% across the board and across both assets and liabilities. One might say that there are no risks here because assets and liabilities are affected evenly, like lending rates increase by 1% and borrowing rates also rise by 1%. So it might be all a wash, right? Well, people are tempted to think that there might be no changes at all because the net margin is still the same. 6% minus 2% equals 4%, right? But in real life, the liabilities are the ones that get repriced first. So borrowing costs start moving up while the lending rates only get repriced at later dates, if ever, which means for current P&L, there is a deterioration in the margin. For example, borrowing rates might move up to 2%, but asset rates don't move up until after repricing. So for the meantime, the margin is just 3%. So this is also a gap problem, where previously the gap was in the timing of cash flows or tenor. Here it means a gap in interest rates. So this is what it would look like in terms of the simple financial statements. Eventually, in the long run, rates on assets do catch up and the margin might revert to the situation prior to the rise in interest rates. And it would look like this. However, if interest rates start going up too much, some bank borrowers might default and walk away from their loans. So there is an issue of credit risk here, meaning while higher rates on the asset side should be good for the bank, too high an interest rate might mean defaults and the inability to recover funds and earn money on these loans. So here, while interest rate risk is the main risk, there is credit risk which is at play here as well. Now, there's a way to avoid this issue. Just lend to the safest possible borrower. That will be the US government. Lending to the government. So instead of lending, say, in terms of real estate or mortgage loans, or lending to big commercial borrowers, the bank instead can lend money to the government. How? Well, by just buying government treasury bills or bonds. Here, there is no credit risk for all practical purposes, as that borrowing is guaranteed to be paid by government. Now, the financial statement might look something like this. Now we return to the situation where interest rates start moving up by 1% across the board and across assets and liabilities as before. As before, there's also a squeeze in the margin. But what happens to the asset side? Well, that depends on the accounting treatment of this bond. If the bank were holding these government bonds under a fair value through profit or loss, FVTPL account, then the unrealized losses will flow through the P&L lowering earnings compared to the previous periods. If these were available for sale accounts, on the other hand, these losses won't flow through the P&L but will still reduce the equity portion directly on the balance sheet. Finally, if these were held to maturity, however, the unrealized gains have no impact on the balance sheet and P&L, although there are only disclosure requirements in the footnotes for transparency, but it does not affect the financial statements. As can be gleaned from this, contrary to the notion that there might be no interest rate risk if yields move across assets and liabilities in just the same way, well, reality is actually messier. To highlight this, if a bank, say, lags behind in increasing its rates for depositors, these might move to another bank. And if they do, that might require cash outflows. And if they are substantial enough, the bank may also have to sell their otherwise good but for now underwater bonds at a loss to fund these withdrawals, which further depresses the prices of their bonds, triggering a negative spiral of even bigger losses in order to get cash for the ever-growing withdrawals. This is especially problematic if the withdrawals become bank runs, as depositors fear for the safety of their money. And it's here we're going to shift to the case of Silicon Valley Bank. Silicon Valley Bank is a good example of what can go wrong when proper interest rate risk management and asset-liability management, or ALM, are not paid attention to properly, especially during good times when business is doing well. The bank mainly drew a depositor base from the tech crowd that's swimming in cash from investors and depositing it short-term with the bank. The bank then invested in U.S. Treasury bonds, no credit risk at all, the safest of the safe, and what could possibly go wrong? It turns out, everything. As business and markets awoke from the COVID slumber and due to rising energy prices on top of supply shocks from the supply dislocations and shutdowns during the COVID period, inflation started spiraling upwards, forcing the U.S. Federal Reserve to start hiking rates in 2022 from near zero to eventually somewhere between 5% and 5.25%. Now, two things started to happen. One, before the interest rate hikes, when overnight rates were practically zero, money just kept on slushing around as the Fed ensured a super liquid environment during the COVID pandemic. This meant that there was a lot of money that was being invested, especially with the tech sector, and that tech sector parked their money with the banks short term. However, with interest rates going up, funding for this tech sector started to go somewhere else where it could earn better money, leaving these tech companies to start drawing down from their own funds that they park with the banks. This induced banks to service these withdrawals, and for Silicon Valley Bank, this meant selling their long-term government treasury bonds. However, remember that when interest rates go up, these treasury bonds lose value. This should be merely valuation losses, but since they needed to be sold, these losses got locked in and became realized losses. The more they needed more cash for withdrawals by depositors, the more they needed to sell these bonds, depressing the value of their asset holdings even more, especially as it became a fire sale. In short, SVB reportedly sold over $21 billion in treasury bonds and securities at a $1.8 billion loss on March 8, 2023, to cover massive depositor withdrawals amid rising interest rates that devalued its long-term bond holdings. This action triggered a bank run, with $42 billion reportedly withdrawn in just one day, leading to the bank's seizure by regulators on March 10. In the end, this was an issue of interest rate risk mismanagement in a poorly constructed intermediation business, reflecting a poor understanding of asset-liability management. So in part 2 of this episode, we shall discuss the basics of interest rate risk management via gapping and asset-liability management. And we hope that you can pick up some lessons that might be useful for you as a financial professional, as a financial analyst, or as a market participant. If you found this video helpful, kindly like and subscribe to help support our channel. And see you next time!